Well, it's good to see you today on day number 20, and I know this video is coming out a little later than we usually release these videos. It's coming out in the afternoon, so happy afternoon. I had to run out to Primgar for a pastor's meeting with the Alliance, and man, Primgar is a little further out of town than I thought, so a few more cornfields between me and Primgar. But on the way back to Hall, I'm stopping by to make this video because we are continuing this series as we look at different things that we need to learn to let go of, things that the Bible talks about that we need to lay down or put at the foot of the cross and just say, hey, these are things that caused me to stumble, and in the meantime I need to pick up certain things to replace those things. But today, we're looking at a famous verse, and the interesting thing about all of these is that they kind of overlap. In a way, we're talking about a very similar theme. And so I thought today's Bible verse that I chose on what we should surrender, what we should let go, really kind of involves almost everything we've been talking about. And so I wrote down 5 reasons or 5 ways that we can actually live out this verse. Well, let me highlight what the verse is first. So it comes from what Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. And you've probably seen this verse many times, and we've probably heard it mentioned many times. We may have never really considered what this actually means, though, at times. Because what this does require is for us to let go of certain things. Especially whenever Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So if we are to basically present our bodies as a living sacrifice, like let go of our bodies, of who we are as a living sacrifice, what does that mean? And so that's really what I want to dive into for the next few minutes, is what does that mean when Paul says, I want you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice? How do we do that? How do we live out this verse, especially in light of Easter and how God calls us to live? And so let me just give us 5 ways. And by the way, you might be able to write down your own list and add a few things to the 5 reasons or the 5 ways I believe we can live out being a living sacrifice. So, but I'm gonna give us 5 reasons or 5 ways we can do this. The first way to become a living sacrifice is this. I think it requires learning to renew our minds. And this comes from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. In fact, Paul said, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And so there's many things that we see with our eyes, or that we believe certain things, that we perceive certain things, but that's only because we're thinking the way that the world thinks, or we're looking at it through the lens upon what we've been taught, maybe what has happened in our past. And what Paul is saying is, no, we sometimes need to be a living sacrifice. We need to let go of our thinking and allow God to renew our minds, to help us be able to have spiritual eyes into whatever the particular situation is. Not our own eyes, not our own physical eyes, or how we see a particular issue by our feelings or those things. And by the way, that's hard to do. I know that. But what Paul is saying is, you want to be a living sacrifice, you got to renew your minds. And that's, actually the first thing he says after he mentions how we are to be a living sacrifice. It's Romans 12, verse 2, the very verse after. And then he goes on to say, how do our lives become a living sacrifice? Well, this is what Peter would say. Peter gives us an answer, and I believe Peter says that we are to pursue holiness. In fact, let me pull up the verse right now. One second. I know sometimes you don't want awkward silence on a video, but here we go. Let me pull it up. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all of your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So Peter would say, I believe being a living sacrifice, or living out your life as a living sacrifice, it comes down to holiness. Now, again, that is hard to do. I mean, all these things are hard to accomplish. But what is holiness? Yeah, separation. So separate ourselves from the way the world behaves, the way the things the world pursues, the things that entangle us in the world, but instead pursue that separation and focus on God, focus on how we are to live according to His Word. All those things are part of this idea of holiness. And if you pursue holiness, then you are living your life as a living sacrifice. Okay, here we go. Next thing. How do we live our lives as a living sacrifice, as Paul calls us towards? Number 3, I think it would be to serve others unselfishly. Serve others unselfishly. And this is another verse I think we're very aware of what it says. It's just sometimes hard to do, which is to love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. This idea of loving one another with brotherly affection, outdoing one another in showing honor. I mean, those are some of the tough things in life to do, right? Like to love people that just drive you crazy, or to honor someone even if you feel like they don't deserve honor. Like there's people that maybe say things that are tough to handle, tough to receive, and yet are you going to honor that person? Maybe someone does something to you that you don't like. Are you going to honor that person? See, in order to be a living sacrifice, in order to surrender yourselves, you have to get to a point where you're loving one another with brotherly affection and honoring that person. Because you're essentially lowering yourself, trying to live in humility by what? Lifting up the other person. You can't hold on to any part of yourself and be a living sacrifice. Number 4 here, this is what Paul says. And again, a lot of these are from Romans chapter 12. And it makes sense why it would be from Romans chapter 12, because that's how he begins this chapter. Become a living sacrifice. And this is another good one, but he says really essentially to use our gifts for God's glory. And he says it in Romans chapter 12, verses 6 and 8. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. Like if prophecy in proportion to our faith, if service in serving, the one who teaches in his teaching, the one who exhorts in his exhortation, the one who contributes in generosity, the one who leads with zeal, the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. We see this as a list of gifts, and the Bible gives us all these different gifts. But notice what Paul says, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. See, I have seen so many people and I'm not talking about here in Iowa, I'm talking about in Washington State, I'm talking about in Ohio, I'm talking about, even at times myself. I mean, I have to include this in the equation, but people with so many gifts, either in music or writing or fellowship or hospitality. I mean, people have so many gifts, and yet they don't use them. They say, well, I don't have time for it, or I'm just going to let that other person do that, or I'm just going to set those things aside. I'm not going to use it because it's not the right time in my life. And by the way, there's legitimate reasons why sometimes it isn't the right season for us to use those gifts. But the thing of it is sometimes that just becomes the habit. There are so many things that people are gifted in, and yet they don't use those gifts. And Paul's saying, no, let us use those gifts. Because again, if we are to be a living sacrifice, which means is we're sacrificing of ourselves to God, then we are to sacrifice our time in order to use our gifts. And sometimes we just don't make that as part of the equation. Number 5, and the last thing I wrote down here was practice continual worship. Practice continual worship. And this basically is just us learning to basically worship, worship continually. I mean, Hebrews chapter 13 says this, 15, 16, though through him let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of the lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. Like, it isn't a one-time deal, like on a Sunday morning that we are to come together to worship. Become a living sacrifice means that we do this continually. And we do it even throughout the week or whatever that looks like. I know I went a little long here. There's 5 reasons I gave you, 5 Bible verses that support the reason on why I believe or how we are to be this living sacrifice. And I pray that these are just helpful for us to see, and they're helpful for us to meditate on. And I know some of them are very challenging. I mean, there's no doubt. Some of them are maybe thought-provoking. Some of them maybe hit us right in our hearts, like, man, I haven't been a living sacrifice. If you're going to use that as one of the ways that we are to be this living sacrifice. But it challenges all of us. It challenges me. It is the gold standard. The Word of God is the gold standard, and it calls us forward to strive to these things. So if you're not doing these things, or one of these things, or some of these things, or whatever, it doesn't mean that you cannot do those. It's just something that we strive towards, and we strive towards together, and we strive towards during the season of Lent, as we really consider things that we need to sacrifice. And in this case, we need to sacrifice ourselves. We need to be a living sacrifice. I hope this was helpful. Maybe a little longer than other videos, but I pray that this is encouraging, and it just helps you see maybe things from a different perspective. So God bless. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we continue this Lent video series. So God bless.